Our second panelist is Dr. Peter Grabbe. Dr. Grabbe, as both Director of the Open Society European Policy Institute and Director of EU Affairs, works to ensure that open society values are at the heart of EU policies and actions, both inside and outside the borders. From 2004 to 2009, she was Senior Advisor to then European Commissioner for Enlargement, Olli Rehn, responsible in his cabinet for the Balkans and Turkey. Before joining the Commission, she was Deputy Director of the Centre for European Reform, the London-based think tank where she published widely on EU enlargement and other European issues. Her academic career includes teaching at the London School of Economics and research at Oxford and Birmingham Universities, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and European University Institute.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I was asked to speak about the rise of illiberalism, and in fact, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, following on from what Professor Coco has just been talking about, the way that domestic politics interacts with what's happening in terms of the global order. Because I think one of the big questions is there in fact a collapse of the liberal world order? Is there something more of a lapse? Because that seems to be the assumption often in Brussels in terms of EU policy making, that what we're living through are extraordinary times and at some point it will all return to normal. Perhaps when there's a new US president, maybe things will simply get better and we'll return to what was there before. I think this is not actually a collapse. What we're seeing is a significant erosion, but I suspect that that erosion is not a lapse. It may well be permanent. So how do we live with an order that is clearly eroded on the normative side, and what are its practical implications? That's really the issue I'd like to address this morning. Over the past century, both the Europeans and the Americans have been quite successful at shaping their images in the world. But now those images are being shaped for them to a much greater extent. And there are plenty of other actors that are promoting very different values and counter-narratives. There's the civilizational narrative that Christopher Coco was just talking about, which you hear both from Moscow and Beijing. There are also counter-narratives that come through new means. It's not just governments that promote narratives. It's also new TV channels, well, relatively new, like Al Jazeera. But also Russia Today. It's of course also social media. In the past, foreign policy was a lot about maps and chaps, and it was possible for research institutes and foreign ministers to go out and set the agenda on international relations. Now they have plenty of rivals. There's no longer an elite monopoly over international relations. It's something that any citizen can feel they are somehow informed about and involved in through their smartphone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are involved in an order. They may be involved in a series of narratives, and some of those may well be eroding that order, which is why the normative framing of it is really very important, because it's not enough simply to talk to foreign policy elites. It's actually vital to talk to the public as well. Domestic politics has a much greater role than it used to in international relations. So if the Western narratives are no longer the norm, and also our export models have been weakened, export models in terms of the soft power that Joseph Nye talked about as regards the US, that was there also for the European Union through the enlargement process until 2007. These are things that are becoming weaker as the normative framing of our policies are eaten away from within, as the narratives within the EU about values are changing. Christopher Coco also pointed out how Viktor Orban and indeed others, Jaroslaw Kaczynski, for example, Matteo Salvini, are saying things which didn't used to be considered normal for mainstream politicians, and certainly not for politicians who are in government. And that has an impact because it affects the way that the public, voters, and policy debates consider norms and values as well. Populist politics is becoming rather more widespread, and we see rising illiberalism in many parts of Europe and also other democracies. This is not a purely European phenomenon. It's definitely there in the US. It's also there in, for example, Brazil, as we see right now with the presidential election. But before I go on, I just want to define for a moment the term populism, because it's increasingly used as a term of abuse rather than a term of analysis, and that makes it much less useful as a term. I follow the definition used by the Dutch political scientist Cas who's one of the great experts on populism. There's quite a big literature on it. Margaret Canavan, a British political scientist, talked about populism as being the dark side of democracy in the 1970s. But Kath Muller's definition is a very helpful one. He defines populism not as an ideology, but as a way of seeing politics and society, which claims that both politics and society are structured into an elite, a corrupt elite, and a pure people whose will is not respected by the elite. You can immediately translate that into any national context you might know well. The corrupt elite denying the will of the people. This is the ultimate populist narrative. And populist politicians usually portray themselves as, I'm the one who can speak the voice of the people, who can connect it directly into the pure people and their general will. Therefore, majoritarian elections are fine, direct democracy referendums are fine, because I can interpret the results, because I'm directly connected to the people, and all this representative democracy stuff, it's largely irrelevant. And it tends to be illiberal, because it tends to deny minority voices and pluralism, and it tends also to be quite nationalistic, because it sees the pure people as the only just and legitimate inhabitants of the country, of the territory, and indeed of the nation. So that also fits quite well with the civilizational narrative that we were just hearing about. Now, in that populist view of the world, foreign policy is something you enter into only because you really have to. Because if you are the strongman leader who is tapping directly into the will of the people, why would you negotiate with anybody, especially foreigners, especially people who are not like you? So this suspicion of foreigners and suspicion of elites who negotiate with other elites is built into the populist view of the world, which is why on the whole they're very anti-EU, because what is the EU but a giant negotiations and compromise building machine between elites who are foreigners to one another. So that's what you tend to see, and of course that also tends to translate to the international order, because populists on the whole don't believe that there should be binding agreements between governments unless they are fully in charge of them. So the whole idea of an international rules-based order rather than an international bargain-based order is something that they contest. Now this matters because it's in those rules and in the complexity of that law-based system that you build in the values and the norms. Bargain-based transactional relationships, they may contain norms, but they may not. The norms are optional, and that's a very different thing. And it matters a lot because it changes the whole way you look at the world. If you think about the way that the strongmen leaders tend to portray themselves and their illiberal view of the world, the narratives go something like this. I'm the only realist around here. It's a tough world out there. Our community needs protection at any cost. Our civilization even needs protection at any cost. This is an existential threat. I'm the only one who's brave and strong enough to provide this protection. I'm not afraid to say that we need to circle the wagons, to build the high walls, to raise the fences, to get tough with our enemies, and be nasty. Be nasty to turn back the tidal wave of immigrants, to turn back all of the historical enemies. This is the narrative you'll hear over and over again, and you can fit it to any national context that you'd like to see. The difference now is, this narrative is there, it's there in most democracies, but in the past it tended to get 5, maybe 10, maybe 12% of the vote. Now it's getting, in many countries, including EU member states, 25% of the vote, even 30% of the vote. That is new. That is really new. And that changes the outlook for international relations as well. Now, and the big problem with the populist view of the world is that it's actually not realism, it's pseudo-realism. It's actually an illusion, because it denies the facts of interdependence that Jamie Shea was talking about, the facts of global markets, of globally interdependent economies, as well as the interdependence of international relations itself. Now, I don't need to start explaining to this audience the dangers of unilateralism, but rather I would like to just point out that over the next few years, the danger is that the populist and illiberal lapses could last for long enough that we won't have prepared for the major transnational and intergenerational challenges that are coming. And this is really the big danger. It's something that used to be marginal, it's now becoming very mainstream, it's now there in a number of governments, but it matters greatly because we actually need to prepare for some major challenges that require a rules-based order, which require transnational solutions and really quite robust, comprehensive policies, which are agreed on through some kind of legally binding mechanism. And of course, you all know what are these major challenges, but I'll just explain briefly the values part of them. So the first one is, of course, climate change, which is going to be a massive disruptor and which will increase many of the pressures that populists are now using very effectively in their narratives to raise fear in the population. It will increase the pressure for people to move around the world in unpredictable ways, and it will require a very high degree of trust between governments in terms of the implementation of targets from everything from climate emissions to other forms of transnational environmental protection, where it's really vital to have a rules-based order. It's incredibly difficult to get the kind of collective action needed and the kind of shared understanding of and analysis of the problem to effectively to affect climate change without that. Then, of course, there's digital transformation, which has become not only a major changer of our societies and is also changing norms in the way that we think, but it's also one of the main vectors of non-military means of warfare. The plethora of information online and the spread of fake news has weakened the monopoly of foreign ministries and security experts, like most of this room, as providers of information and wisdom, and it will go further than that. It's not just about the war of the robots, as Jamie Shea said, it's also about asymmetric warfare of a very different kind, of undermining the trust and faith of voters in the whole democratic process. If you look at the very interesting studies that have now been done on what happened in the German and the Italian elections last year, and what may well happen in the European Parliament elections next year, is disinformation, which is not necessarily pushing the line or the interests of one party or another. It's simply undermining faith in the system altogether. It's telling voters, you can't trust the system, the election is being hacked, there's no point in voting, none of these parties is representing your interests. That is a very different kind of undermining. And it's a very strong one, it's a very important one, because it means that if you have voter withdrawal, then our system no longer functions. And of course, there's a further disruptor, which is lifetime. Aging populations in Europe are going to change the nature of work and the role of the state in Europe. Employment and income look very likely to go up and down over one's lifetime. Self-employment could become the norm, and individuals will have to save a lot more for their pensions and for their old age care. That is going to have an impact on international relations too. One example is that in terms of grey power, grey voters are much less willing and interested in paying for fighter jets and aircraft carriers. They have a very different view of what security is about. They also tend to be much less interested in intervention of various kinds abroad. And they're not so very interested in responsibility for other parts of the world. I'm talking here about the age cohorts that you can see in various surveys. Now, none of these disruptors can be stopped or prevented through unilateral action and isolationism. Rather, you actually need long-term, robust, comprehensive policies that can hold across borders and across time. And this is, of course, why the European Union is needed. It's why many of the international institutions are needed, just at a moment when they are, in fact, being undermined by illiberalism. So how to keep the narrative together? Well, I think one of the key things is actually to talk about, instead of the typical argument that you hear very often in security debates, it's about values versus interests. To think of it rather as being about a hard choice between short-term stability and long-term stability. So in terms of the short-term, long-term, the key question is what keeps societies stable and what keeps regimes in check so that they don't go to war, so they don't pick fights with their neighbours. Now, there are plenty of ways of thinking about this particular issue, but I just point out the way that the undermining of the stability of the liberal international rules-based order happens because of this idea of pseudo-realism that you frequently hear from populists. First of all, they say the rule of law really doesn't matter. Rule of law can, it's optional. It doesn't need to apply to me. I'm a strongman leader. I have a direct line to my people. But they're not looking at the fact that, for example, the single market, most economic prosperity is underpinned by the rule of law, because that's what provides stability for investment, for trade, for business. Secondly, protectionism and special deals with foreign powers tend to hurt small countries the most. So if you've got EU members that are cutting their own special deals with Putin and are saying, well, actually, we don't really need to have EU common external action because we want to have these special deals, ultimately, the countries that are 10 million people, 20 million people, even I would argue countries like the one I know best, 75 million people, are actually the ones who suffer the most. Paul-Henri Spaak said rightly, former Prime Minister of Belgium, we are all small countries in Europe now. The difference is between those who know it and those who don't. And of course, European countries are all getting smaller, both in terms of GDP and also in terms of population. Even France and Sweden with their relatively high birth rate. And certainly some of the smaller countries are getting smaller very fast. Then there's the problem of zero-sum nationalism, which makes sustained cooperation impossible, makes it incredibly difficult, again, to agree on issues like climate. And xenophobia of the kind that is promoted by illiberal populists tends to become self-perpetuating. And xenophobia within a country tends to spill over to the countries next door. This is the lesson of the 1930s. That once you have very high social tensions, a lot of scapegoating, a lot of blame of minorities in one country, there tends to be a look over the border and an assumption that that these tensions also apply to your neighbours. Because illiberalism and populism depends on a kind of constant mobilization by the leader of the public against external threats of various kinds. And so if you run out of external threats, if you actually have reasonably good relations with your neighbours, you need to create them. You could start by blaming Brussels, you could start by blaming the black helicopters of the UN, whatever external enemy you want to choose, but it tends to then lead into some kind of conflict. And of course, the loss of trust and cohesion within the society tends to create a dynamic of disintegration of institutions as well. So if you think about the kind of illiberal view of Europe and what it should look like, if you put together the statements of Orban, Kaczynski, Salvini, various others, also Hans-Christian Strache, I mean, there are plenty of others, Nigel Farage. I don't wish to be nationalist about this. You can find populists in every country. But if you put together their worldview, what you find is a Europe that looks something like this. Citizens are wary, even hostile towards foreigners and ethnic minorities. States need harsh policies to ensure that migrants are kept out, minorities are kept down. Being friendly towards foreigners and minorities is a betrayal of the nation. The ruling party must run the country according to the people's will, expressed through majority votes in referendums. Governments have to avoid comprehensive regional trade agreements, but they can enter into bilateral deals, that's fine. Just please don't impose any international rules and standards on issues like human rights, the rule of law, and so on. And finally, policies really don't have to be consistent. They can be patchy, they can be unsustainable. If you look at the economic policies of the populists, for example, you find extremely patchy views. Anti-globalization, yes, but where, and the belief in the national economy. And yet, how does that work when all European economies are highly interdependent, trade with one another, and most of them are also very dependent on trade abroad. So how does that work? So I would just finish by saying, I think the danger that we have in all of this is that views of the really major long-term transnational intergenerational problems and also the question of how to deal with problems in neighbouring countries are getting reduced by the illiberal view of the world and by various populist leaders in Europe into some really very small, inward-looking politics based on fear, based on constant mobilization, which are not equipping us well, to say the very least, to what we deal with long-term. And this undermining of long-term stability is, of course, dangerous. And it has an immediate effect, particularly on EU policies towards neighbouring countries, because there is a tendency now to seek stability at any cost, particularly to seek deals that keep migrants out, that keep migrants held at various borders. And these countries are not going to be stable if they are run by regimes that continuously repress democratic institutions and freedom, which may seem like they're ready and willing to work with us on migration in the short term, but they're not going to help us in addressing the major disruptors. And of course, ultimately, their population is going to find another means of expressing itself politically too, because in fact there is no monolithic will of the people. The strongman leader tends in the end not to run a stable regime which allows for social peace. So I can't give you very much optimism, except to say that if we could only focus on these external and very big issues, the transnational challenges of climate, of digital, of lifetime, and actually start much more of a debate about stop talking about migration as if it is primarily a threat rather than a phenomenon, if we could actually focus on what needs to be faced, then it's much easier to make the case for international cooperation, for continuing integration, and for having some kind of rules-based order rather than the transactional approach. Thank you.